You ready?
I'm ready.
All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited today to have as my guest, Dr. Michael Gaskell. Michael, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, Guy.
All right, man. So Dr. Gaskell is a veteran principal in New Jersey, currently the principal at Hammarskjold Middle School in East Brunswick. Michael's been actively writing about highly relevant solutions to problems in educational leadership since 2018. His second book, Leading Schools Through Trauma, was just published in September of 2021 with Routledge's imprint, Eye on Education. Mike, like I said before we started recording here, it's unfortunately very timely that you're on this podcast to talk about this topic. But before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
So I was born and raised in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
All right.
I didn't make a big move. I moved to New Jersey, which is about an hour and a half away, but it feels like a culture shift, if you will. So New Jersey's different.
Okay.
But I've been an educator here for the last in New Jersey for the last 25 years as a special education teacher, which has some of the roots that I know we'll talk about for me,
Okay.
as well as an administrator.
Where in Philly were you?
Westchester area of suburban Philadelphia.
Okay. So I spent a lot of time in Philly and Pennsylvania and then New Jersey. So
okay, so you've had soft pretzels and
cheesesteaks. I grew up with that.
That's it. So you're good. You're acculturated.
All right, awesome. All right, so what the heck is going on? I mean,
I mean, we could probably spend a couple hours on this, but we're gonna give your audience the highlight reel and also some refreshing solutions, I think, which is what they really need to hear. Right now, we're dealing with some real crises between a post-pandemic world or still coming out of a pandemic, some inequity issues that came to bear during that same time. And then, of course, we've had this most recent tragedy in Michigan. And it's just heartbreaking when you see the things that have happened and the lives that have been lost. And I keep pointing back to the things that I've learned about, developed, and shared, and stolen ideas from, by the way. I don't just create my own. That work when you're helping kids, especially kids that are traumatized, anxious, stressed, under duress. They're all facing this. And by the way, the adults are too. So there's two pieces of this. It's not just about helping the kids. A whole chapter of the book I just published is dedicated to self-care and teachers understanding that they need to it's the oxygen mask concept. You got to put it on yourself first before you can hand it off to somebody else. And so that's an important factor in all this too. But there's so much that is involved in this. And one of the things that really strikes me is a program that we brought to my school a few years ago. I call it a schoolhouse adjustment, and I've also called it a restorative service plan. Essentially the same concept, just used with different people. And what it is you get school security to literally have a mentoring relationship with kids who otherwise would have been suspended or disciplined severely. It's a trade-off, and it's a fantastic one, because what you're doing is you're creating an opportunity for kids who may otherwise have a different opinion about law enforcement. And most of our school security here in New Jersey are retired police, and I would assume that's the case in many places throughout the United States. And they have a very negative attitude, sometimes multi-generational. So we need to flip that script by showing that school security aren't just arresting people for what seems to be an unfair thing or whatever the perception is, and instead are actually uncles, dads, and mentors, and that they're not there to issue discipline. They're actually there to help this kid and build a relationship. And you also then get the school security to start to look from a different lens at these kids. So there's this cyclical thing that's starting to reverse this script. And those are just some of the very basic nuts and bolts ideas that we need to start instituting in schools nationwide so that you're not hearing about tragedies like this too often. I'm not saying we can prevent it all, but most of the school security issues are not about securing in the physical sense. It's about the relationship building sense.
Okay. So let's take a step back here and I realize this topic is so incredibly immense that, trying to squeeze it into this short amount of time is nearly impossible. But let's take a little step back here. Generally speaking, from your opinion, when these incidences, these shootings, these killings are happening, are there common denominators within those that we can?
Yes, there are repeated patterns that over and over again we look at and literally shake our heads when we meet with school security, when we examine this with our counseling team, because we're, as a school, looking actively at these things and trying to learn from them. And I would certainly hope that others are too, which was really some of the things that drove me to write about ways to not deal with school shootings specifically, but of course my topics are about trauma, which is why I'm on your podcast. And so you see these patterns. You see kids who are not attended to, kids who may have difficult home lives, kids who are feeling like they're gravitating towards a negative force. We have to flip all of that around. And there are specific ways that we can do that. I talked real quick about the RSP thing and schoolhouse adjustment. There's even things like, I do this really cool thing in my school, which is I wrote about, called Middles to Littles. And we had a preschool program move into my school. Now you can do this virtually too. So you can find any daycare in your community nowadays. And we have at-risk kids who have had a good run of behavior go in and read to these little 3 and 4 year olds. Now, reading to the 3 and 4 year olds is like dog therapy, because these kids are so excited and they don't care what you look like or how big and intimidating you are. You're just a cool big middle schooler, and they're blind to all that, which is fantastic because that kid then gravitates toward this. This became really cool to do in my school. So you've got all these at-risk kids going into these preschools with these little chairs and sitting on these little chairs with these kids, and they're contagious. And the best part of this is some of the cognitive biases that adults have, and let's just call it what it is, are those things that teachers are saying, hey, listen, I'm seeing this kid now from a different lens. He just went and read to 3-year-olds, and he's been good because of that. So you have all of these things sort of compounding on each other that are positive instead of negative. And that's how you start to shift a school culture and get kids away from the ultimate tragedies that, like we've just mentioned.
So in terms of common denominators, you're talking about, and I think this comes up in terms of trauma treatment and so forth. This stuff doesn't just happen, right? It's not out of the blue, although it may seem out of the blue, but you're saying that oftentimes these kids are from, not surprisingly, broken homes, traumatized homes, and so forth. And what you're saying here is, let's bring them into the fold. And these kids need something. Obviously they do.
They want attention. And if we can flip that to positive attention, that's hard to do, by the way. It's not like you can just snap a finger and it happens, but with specific and numerous stacked strategies, you can do that. You can accomplish it. So,
okay, let me just take an aside here. How the heck, Mike, did this become a passion of yours?
So it's interesting. I just want to tell a little story, if you don't mind. A few years ago, my daughter, who's now a freshman in high school, but she was younger then, was rummaging through some stuff in her grandparents' house when we were visiting one day. And she found this folder that was simply labeled Mike. She opened this folder, and inside of it was a series of failures. There were things like describing me as in an evaluation by a psychologist when I was in upper elementary school as hostile, developmental delayed, socially behind, all of those impulsive, all of those signs that point to the things that we're talking about. And then a series of disciplinary issues and interventions, more disciplinary issues, because I came from that generation. I'm glad that we're trying to balance that more nowadays. We need to do more balancing with interventions in schools. And I never really knew how bad it was until I saw that folder. So I don't really know why my parents kept that folder, but I'm forever grateful they did, because it inspired me to look at this and say, wow, what were the things that helped me get out of all this almost accidentally, that I can sort of do some research on and then give some evidence and then weave story and science together and make an interesting read for people to say, oh my gosh, there's ways to solve this. So I bought in right then. And a little bit earlier than that, I became a special educator because I loved working with the underdog. And I've seen kids. I had a kid who didn't know how to read and write when he was in 6th grade. And when I discovered this and tutored him, I became compelled to help him. And he ended up graduating from West Point. So you see
Wow.
stories like that. You know what I mean? You see stories like that. And we can all, as educators, draw on some sort of an amazing story like that with a kid or kids whose lives we've touched. And I think we have to remember those. And not everything's going to work with every kid all the time, but when we start to increase those interventions, we increase the likelihood. There's this improvement over time of many kids most of the time. And I always tell educators, don't get lost in saving every kid. Most of us want to save every kid. We can't. And I'd love to tell you that we could, but we can't. But we can get a lot more of them. And if we're using some strategies like this, so that was really what inspired me, was learning. Well, I knew I had some difficulties, but I didn't know how profound it was until I actually got back and looked at this documentation
Wow.
pages. I don't know why they saved it, but I thanked them every time they did. And they don't know why either, by the way. Maybe they knew I was going to do something with it constructively, and I'm grateful.
That's amazing. And it's really inspiring too. I mean, I really appreciate you sharing that. You know, what you're talking about here is, just for example, going back to that one example about having the security personnel mentor these kids who might fly under the radar. Um, Talk a little bit about that, about more specifically. I mean, is that something that's overt? Does everyone else see, oh, John's being mentored by whomever? Does that become, or could that possibly become a negative? Talk about it more.
It hasn't. And the reason is I'll give you a couple of quick important reasons why. Number one, we went from a suspension rate that was too high. We were suspending about 6.5% of our students. Now, this is a middle school. How are we suspending 6.5%? And if you've ever looked at the research about suspension, there's absolutely no positive effect, not only on the offender or the student who's disciplined, but also the kids around them, because you start to create this toxic environment. All kinds of research on this. So although it's like one of those things we still have in the bag for some reason in schools, and there are accountability reasons when we get into legal issues, like if there's drug and alcohol use or a severe fighting incident, we do have to go to that. Almost everything else should not be a suspension. And so you start to look at other options like this, and when they hear there's an alternative, they start to buy in, even if that gets them in the door. And then when you have a former police officer taking a knee next to a kid who had a different opinion, possibly, or of law enforcement before that, they start to unwind this thing and say, this guy actually cares about me. And it becomes, again, one of those cool things. A lot of times people are afraid that these kinds of things are going to fail because the tough kids aren't going to see it as cool. Tough
Right.
kids are just like the rest of us. They just have a harder shell, and it's going to take a little harder to get around it because of the trauma that or duress that they have sort of created this cocoon around them to protect themselves. They're also used to adults giving up on them. And so they often go towards that negative because they say, see, that's what happens to me. And what we need to do is, again, reverse that script and show that adults aren't going to give up on them. Again, that's a slow unwind. So when you use programs like this and you have kids involved in programs like this, they really start to feel like they've got a mentor. I just want to mention one really quick, cool study, if you don't mind,
Sure.
that relates to this. Emmy Weirner is a researcher who did a longitudinal study in Kauai, Hawaii, which is one of the more isolated islands. And that made it kind of a perfect case study. There was like 800 or so kids born on the islands one year back in the 1950s. She tracked them for 40 years until they were 40. And what she found was about a third of these kids were at risk. They were impoverished. They didn't have a good home life. They had addiction in their family. They had, developmental delays, all the signs that pointed them to being an at-risk child, like the things I described about myself. And of that group, about a third of them showed resilience beyond that. So they started to look at why. Why was roughly a third of these kids thriving into their adulthood, despite all of these challenges that guaranteed failure? And there were a few protective factors. One was that they had a good affiliation, such as they joined a team, they were part of a church affiliation, they had a group, something positive that connected them. The second thing was a strong adult in their life, a mentor. And so, again, somebody who was a positive role model that was not their father or mother, by the way. This was someone else who was standing in for them, and a few other protective factors. But one of the biggest ones I had to highlight was this idea of a mentor. There's a lot of evidence that mentoring works, and we should be doing more of it in schools where we can set it up. So that's why I felt like it was important to do so. I did also add teachers into this mix, which is why I referred to the restorative service plan, because now I've got teachers doing positive behavior support in schools work as mentors with a program where they meet kids as well. So I've kind of got this blanketed, and it's really starting to help, because sometimes a different adult works with a different kid too. You can't always just say this adult's going to work with every kid. That's not how it works. We all have sometimes challenges with our personalities conflicting. So we need to just be flexible about that and be prepared to make adjustments so that we can serve that kid. Because the end goal is to get them to understand that somebody cares in the school about you, which, by the way, is one of the biggest factors in not having an ultimate tragedy in a school. So I think it's really important to, really add those things in where it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, there's something just so beautiful about that, because you're just going to the source, right? When you look at, well, let me ask you this question. Generally speaking, is what you're talking about here, is this accepted across the nation in terms of schools? Or are schools collectively beginning to look at this type of intervention as something that's needed and necessary?
I think they are, but I think we're also still, so we're seeing a trend in the right direction. But I would say that with a caveat, and that caveat is that you still have these stubborn cognitive biases that, subconscious, that people don't intentionally mean to be looking at a kid and waving the proverbial finger at them, shouting at them, which of course is just going to cause that kid most often to just continue to do that behavior because they're getting attention, even though it's negative. And instead going over them, say, hey, I heard you read to that 3-year-old class the other day. That's great. When are you reading again? And you didn't even address the behavior, and the kid stopped the misbehavior because you turned it into a positive thing. So I think there needs to be a different lens that we're sort of presenting teachers and staff with, because they're often getting jaded with the challenges that we face in schools, understandably. If we can flip that script with some of these really opportunistic examples and show them that it works, then it's worth it. Then it's worth it every step of the way.
Excuse me. I can cut this out here.
No problem.
When you look at what happened in Michigan, what are some of the questions you're curious about?
I want to know, again, if this kid had any positive relationships with adults. I want to know, it seems to me like there were some adults sort of highlighting the concerns, but it was almost too late, although I don't know the whole context, in fairness to that school community. So all I can say is what were some of the interventions, and also to what degree. Oftentimes I'll say to kids, oftentimes I'll say to teachers about kids, when they say to me, the kids don't go, this kid doesn't go home and do their homework, and they don't come prepared and all this. And, their parents should do this. My favorite answer to them is, you're right, they absolutely should, but guess what? They're not. So are we going to decide to just point our finger at that? Or are we actually going to just do what we can for the 6.5 hours we have this kid to help them be successful? Have those materials ready for them. We have a check-in program where we have teachers who volunteer to work with kids who go to, frankly, home to a home life where it's often chaos. And when they come in, the teacher sits down and says, what do you need? What do you have? Did you get breakfast? Make sure that they're equipped and ready for the day. And at the end of the day, we have a checkout teacher. What do you need? What can you do? Let's keep you motivated. And again, if you notice, I'm sort of talking all around this idea of mentoring from all different angles, right? Academically, behaviorally, socially, all of those factors. So I think those are really some of the biggest things that a lot of times, and you go all the way back to the Columbine tragedy, these kids were either ignored or they were sort of cast aside as outcasts. And they said, well, we'll show you who's an outcast, right? So we got to flip that script, and we really have, and kids in general want to be open-minded, and they tend to be very liberal in their thoughts. So we need to seize on that and build that into the school. And again, I have to emphasize this. We've got to prove that to teachers, sometimes taking big risks as educational leaders or as teacher leaders, to show the rest of the cynical group of the staff, because there are people like that who understandably may feel that, but they need to see that there's another alternative. And that's refreshing. And that's the way we can get around that and identify these signs.
I would imagine that some teachers are like, you know what, Mike, that sounds great, but that's not my job.
They may. And I go back to something I said earlier, which is, you're right. I love saying this when someone says something like this to me. You're absolutely right. This should not be your job. But we can sit here and be frustrated with this kid all day. Or, and I always give the example, would you like this kid to be out of his seat 20 times a class or 3? 3's not perfect, but I'm going for 3 every time over 20. And so my point is we're always looking for progress. We're not expecting perfection from these kids, and we shouldn't be, just like we shouldn't be from ourselves. And so it's important that when they hear there's an option like this, that's going to make their lives easier, they can start to buy in. Also, when you start promoting programs like that Middles to Littles I mentioned, and when you start to see suspension rates drop, people say it seems like better in this building now. And I'll often point to those examples, and I'll invite teachers to go watch that at-risk kid read, get down, giant 6-foot kid, get down with 3-year-olds and read a book, right, called Pete the Cat, which is about recognizing who you are, and they're just seeing their vision change. It's incredible. And so it's moments like that can make a really difference. I just want to mention one other story that I love sharing with teachers that highlights this. It was a story written by a teacher a few years back called 3 Letters from Teddy Roy. I don't know if you ever heard this story. It's a great story. It's one of those you can read in like 10 minutes. And it's a true story based on her experience. She had this boy, he comes in and he's disheveled, and he's sort of that kid who, teachers never want to admit it, but they get annoyed by certain kids, right? And she kind of got under her skin, and he was falling asleep in class. So she starts to look through his records, like, what's going on here? Early records indicated he was a pleasant, bright young man. Then the next year, he seems okay, but his mother's sick and his dad seems to be distracted by this. Next year, his mother dies. And suddenly he's starting to make this decelerated decline. And it's a very gloomy outlook for this kid. And so she decides there's something different that I should be doing about this. So the Christmas holidays come, and she referenced Christmas, not to be denominational, but the point is about gift giving. And the kids were all exchanging gifts, and they were giving gifts to their teacher too. And she opened his present, which was in a brown paper bag, and the kids kind of snickered, that's Teddy's, sloppy attitude or whatever. And she pulls out like a partially filled bottle of perfume and a bracelet that was broken. And she puts the bracelet on and she says, "Isn't this nice?" And she puts some of the perfume on, and she thinks, let me just do the right thing here, because the kids are watching, like almost every teacher would do. At the end of the class, the kids leave for the winter holidays, and he comes up to her and he says to her, and this always gets me every time, "You smell just like my mother." And he leaves, and she bawls for the next hour. And she says, "I gotta help this kid." He comes back in the new year, and she stays after school like virtually every day she can and helps this kid. And years go by, and he keeps sending her letters and, "Hey, I'm doing okay, and I'm hanging in there, and it's been rough, but I'm doing," until finally he gets a degree, a college degree, and then he gets a doctoral degree. He becomes an MD. And then the last letter he sends her is, "I'd love for you to come to my wedding and sit in the place my mother would have been." Now, when I tell, okay.
Shut up. Oh, God.
True story that she wrote about. And so when I tell that story to teachers, I tell it often with that kind of timing that says, "Hey, listen, we can't assume anybody's a lost cause." Right. And there are ways to help kids, And as I said before, I'm living proof, but Teddy Roy sure is too, isn't he? So it's worth sharing those kind of stories to point out that there is a chance for everybody.
Wow. Let me just reintroduce you here. I'm speaking with Dr. Michael Gaskell. He's a veteran principal in New Jersey, currently principal at Hammarskjold Middle School in East Brunswick. His second book, recently out in September, is called Leading Schools Through Trauma. I love talking to you, Michael. I mean, your passion is just, it's so obvious. And that's why I love doing this podcast. And I think I love you even more because you're from the East Coast. I'm originally from the East Coast, but what's your mission? I mean, clearly you have a mission and a passion. Where do you want to go with this? What do you hope to see with this mission?
One of the best experiences I've had since the book published, and I've been writing some articles that often affiliate with some of the, many of these concepts about helping kids through trauma and stress, is that there is a solution, and it can be a refreshing one. Oftentimes we hear all the problems. We hear about the tragedy in Michigan. We hear about the post-pandemic learning loss that kids are experiencing. We hear about all of the addiction that's increased since the pandemic and all of the other challenges. Yeah, it's out there, right? But remember that there were kids in Kauai who showed resilience beyond that. And there were Holocaust survivors that were expected to be institutionalized after the horrors they saw, and they accomplished amazing things. And Google did a really quick study a few years back where they found that their most successful employees were not the Ivy League graduates. It was the kids, or it was the employees who had survived past a trauma and showed post-traumatic growth. So a lot of the things I talk about are, hey, we're not going to save everybody. So don't get lost in that, but we sure can increase that. And that's empowering in and of itself. And here's some solutions to do that. So I get into a lot of those kinds of solutions, throughout the text. And I've done that a lot in experiences talking to great folks like yourself, that there are these options. There are these other ways to turn most kids around. And that's really our mission, and that's what gets me excited.
That's awesome. Who's the book for?
The book is really for any educational leader or teacher, because there's a lot of classroom practices that I talk about, not adding to your already weighted schedule of teaching, but integrating within your existing experience. So I show how you can do that without having to feel lost. And I've had teachers work with me on this. And even for parents. The really cool thing that happened last night is I was talking to my daughter, who's had some, challenges, just like many kids her age. She's 14. And on her desk was my book. And I said, "Are you reading that?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Really? Do you like it?"
Wow.
And she said, "Yes." And I said, "What page are you on?" And I thought she was going to say, "Oh, I didn't really start it yet. I was just going to look at it. It looked interesting." She opened it up to about a third of the way through the book and said, "This is where I'm at in the book."
Wow.
And I was blown away, because I said, okay, so I'm reaching kids too with this thing. My kid, certainly that's a little biased, but still it works. And so the idea is that it's really for any educator or parent.
Right. That's awesome. All right. Before we go here, let's, besides your book, we'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. What about any other books, whether trauma related or not, anything that's inspiring you that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so my favorite right now is Cal Newport did a book called Deep Work a few years back. And it's a great read. He talks a lot about getting away, and he's done some other things since then, about getting away from the distractions like social media that exacerbate trauma and distress. And that whole idea that comparison is a thief of joy, and everybody's comparing their highlight reel on social media. But he talks about getting away from that and really focusing on the deep satisfaction that comes with deep work. And I am now arguing that deep work is the antidote to anxiety and stress, because if you're most of the time people are anxious and stressful because they don't feel like they can accomplish anything, and certainly not anything rewarding. And deep work gives you the exact opposite. So if we can give kids ideas about how to get towards deep work focus, which I do in the book, then you are able to create this highly rewarding experience that then becomes perpetual. And they start building on that and becoming, it's more rewarding, and they're more accomplished, and they're starting to feel, it's a great self-regulation tool. So that's why I recommend Deep Work by Cal Newport.
Cal Newport? I've heard of him. Where have I heard of him?
Well, he's also got his own podcast, and I've heard him on podcasts because I'm like a podcast, geek. I listen all the time. So, he's also had some research out there. It probably points to some solutions, like I said, didn't come right at saying that, this is the antidote to trauma. I'm sort of saying that because when I start to do the research on it, it's very clear to me that when you get anybody focused on a sense of deep accomplishment, they're feeling Think about this too. Here's another way to think of it. Curiosity is the opposite of anxiety. You can't be both curious and anxious at the same time. If you're exploring things, if you're thinking about creativity, so there's a lot of research on that too that shows that. So I love his stuff. He gets really into this and talks about, like I said, he talks about the social media side of things and how that's really, and by the way, social media is not the enemy. Social media is part of our life and it's here. And there are ways to use it in positive and constructive ways. The misinformation campaigns you see online and things like that, those are the opposite. And the highlight reels, that's the stuff that starts to get us in a much more primal sense of thinking and not in those higher states of thinking, like Cal Newport talks about in Deep Work.
Awesome. Mike, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Gaskell, M. Gaskell is my Twitter feed.
Okay.
You can also find me on LinkedIn, Mike Gaskell, and M. Gaskell0 on Instagram.
Awesome.
And one more thing, I have a website, mikesmicrominute.com.
Okay, we'll have all that linked up. Man, you are one inspiring dude, and I sincerely mean it. And I'd love to have you back in the new year. We can talk about other things, but thank you so much, man, for taking the time to do this. And it's amazing that there are people out there like you running schools. It's just so inspiring.
Thanks, I appreciate it, and it's been my pleasure, and I'd love to be back.
Awesome. All right, man.
Share
Take
more
care.
ideas.
All
You
right.
too.